There's sometimes this idea there's some underlying rules that all cultures ascribe to. One thing that keeps up in mind is it kind of is a form or a defense of relativism and a defense of soft universalism. And it's the idea that as we sort of move away from this idea of we don't have to have absolutism, we don't have to have nihilism, we don't have to have relativism, but we can accept some form of universal truths, but in a soft way. And the idea is that that all cultures have certain rules. And one example is the Golden Rule. And it's kind of an interesting thing in that in the West, in Western traditions, we have a Golden Rule, which is basically do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's considered a positive version. And Plato stated it, Jesus stated it, Muhammad stated it. It's been repeated over and over through the centuries in Western society. But there's also a golden rule that is developed in the Eastern world. And the golden rule in the Eastern world that comes through Buddha and Hinduism and all these traditions says, do not do to others what you would not have them do to you. Now, it is negative, and every instantiation of that is negative in form. And every instantiation in the Western is positive in form. It is do unto others as you would have them. And there is do not. So it's negative. It's saying not. One says do it, and the other one says don't do it. And every Eastern tradition follows that, which suggests that the Eastern traditions have all developed a golden rule and probably share roots. You know, Jesus probably had heard this, it was probably a common phrase. You know, Socrates and Plato had probably heard it, Muhammad had probably heard it. You know, and all these Western traditions had heard this version, and so they reiterated it in maybe slightly different wording, but they reiterated a golden rule. The Eastern, same thing, but every one of them is negative in nature. But what's interesting is the idea that there's a positive and a negative, that we can sort of trace a lineage of connection because they're all positive and all negative. But it appears that around the same time, around the same way, a positive version developed in the West and a negative version developed in the East. And while there probably is no clear connection of how these two developed, they both developed and both came up with a golden rule, which suggests that this idea of a golden rule may in fact be some sort of underlying universal, that it's something that is innate within the morality of all people to develop a concept of a golden rule. Now what happens is James Rachels, he's a philosopher who has studied, and he said, if you look at the anthropology, he said there are three basic rules that all cultures adhere to. The three rules are care for your kids, don't kill anybody who's part of your group. You can kill people who aren't, but don't kill anybody in your own group. You don't have to care for people who aren't your children, but you take care of your own children. And don't lie to members of your own group. You can lie to people outside of it, but don't lie to your own members. And he basically says those are the three rules that all cultures have. But what he says every culture has different ways of applying those. For example, as I'm sitting here today, just last week there was news of a baby that was born in Jacksonville, Illinois, last week that was found in a dumpster. Somebody was going to throw some trash in. They heard something move, and they looked, and they found a newborn baby in it. In our society, we have rules that if you have a baby and you can't care for it, or you have an unexpected pregnancy, you suddenly give birth, and this happens sometimes. People don't even know they're pregnant, or they don't know it. Like, I remember one time I was covering the IHSA, Illinois High School Association, as a reporter. I was out there covering, not as the sports, but I was doing like stories about what was going on at the event, and little vignettes. And there was somebody who gave birth to a baby in the bathroom at the event, and they didn't know they were pregnant, and they gave birth, and ambulances came, and it was some teenage girl who apparently, I don't know how it happened, but she gave birth. And I think, if I recall, like, the girl weighed like 100 pounds. I mean, she was really small and never got really big, and she just had a baby. And if I recall correctly, I may be wrong about that, but I think that was the situation. And so it was a very unusual situation, but that does happen. And so, but in our society, we have rules that if you have a baby and you can't care for it, you're allowed to just drop it off at a police station, fire station, other place. There's safe haven laws, and society will take care of it. But in other cultures, perhaps more tribal, primitive societies, that isn't a possibility. And so what Rachel says is there's some places where perhaps there is a rule that, you know, if you can't care for your own child, you're allowed to take your child, instead of leaving it with the police or leaving it with the fire department, that you can just take it out and leave it in the wilderness or basically in a dumpster to die. And that's acceptable in those cultures. It's considered morally okay. And the reason is because in times of famine and other things, if there's one more mouth to feed, you can't care for it if you don't, that you can't care for it. And it's going to be a drain on yourself and your children and your group. And so in times of famine and severe drought and other things, it is okay basically to leave your kid for dead. Now, most of us in the West look at that like we do the person in Jacksonville who put their baby in a dumpster, and we look at that and go, oh my gosh, who would do that? That's horrible, horrible, horrible. But what's happening is what's happening though is the idea that both of them are taking care of their children. It's just in the one case, we can continue to care for our children while giving that baby up for adoption or providing it with other care in our Western society. And the other one, that's not an option. So the best way to care for your other children is to essentially, take out the one that, last one born, first one gone, I guess, kind of, there's always saying, and last hired, first fired when layoffs come around. That, the idea would be is, you get rid of the newest child. While it doesn't appear to ascribe to that theory, it does. And so one idea is that there are these underlying rules. They can apply very differently. We can judge them because of how well they perform in their adherence to those rules, but they are the rules and they are there.